It's a special honor for me to welcome the next speaker, as he is one of my former colleagues at the German Games print publications a decade ago. In the meantime, he has changed from journalism to games publishing. Sebastian Weber is Business Development Manager Games at Koch Media in Munich, one of the largest publishers and distributors in Europe. He will give you some hints and advice what a publisher giant like Koch Media expects from a developer when pitching a game, as well as how to stand out from the competition. This is a Q&A format, so if you have any questions, please use the chat window, and I'm sure Sebastian will happy to answer all the questions coming in. But first, I think we start with the presentation. Let's go. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you, Petra, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it. And just as a disclaimer, because as Petra already told you, the main focus of this talk should be your questions in the end. So therefore, I try to, rush through this presentation a bit, that we have time left. And also as another disclaimer, of course, I can just tell you from our perspective what we think you should be presenting when reaching out to us, and how the whole process works on our side until we sign up a project. But this must not be true for everybody out there, of course. Different publishers might have different approaches to that, but I know from talking to some colleagues that most of them do it similarly, at least. So as Petra introduced me already, I give you a very quick overview of Koch Media, what we do and what we can offer. So first of all, Koch Media is our company. Many of you probably know our biggest games label, which is called Deep Silver. And of course, within Deep Silver, we publish all our games like Kingdom Come, Deliverance, Dead Island, Saints Row, you name it. Also, we have quite a lot of internal studios by now, starting with Deep Silver Volition, Deep Silver Dambuster, Warhorse Studios, Deep Silver Fish Labs since a few weeks, a big Polish studio, Flying Wildhog. We have Milestone in Italy, we have Voxler in France, we have Vertigo Studios, which is focused on VR games and VR publishing. And as you can see, all of them have quite a big amount of employees. Everybody is working on rather bigger projects. The next part that we do, of course, is the publishing side of things, where we have Deep Silver as the label that most of you know, and Ravenscourt, sorry, which is our, let's say, more casual label. And beside of that, we have Vertigo, as said already, for VR games. And as you can see, we have quite a lot of big names here in the list, like Iron Harvest, of course, Wasteland, Man-Eater was quite big, Shenmue 3, and so on. But we, of course, are also open for smaller and more indie-like games, let's say. And the last part that we do is, beside of films, we also have a film distribution department, which I cannot talk about. But beside of that, we also do distribution, of course. So we work with Square Enix, Capcom, Warner Brothers, Sega, Focus, Codemasters, as long as they are not fully merged with Electronic Arts. Let's see what happens there. Calypso, Techland, and so on. So of course, we take care of all the physical distribution for those games in global scale. In certain territories that depends on the partner. And again, also for this part of the business, we are also open for smaller studios, of course. If there is any need from any studio that is just looking for a physical distribution partner, of course, it has to make sense. So for a $9.99 indie game, it doesn't make sense to do a physical distribution. But if the game is fit for physical distribution, we are always happy to talk about that. And we also do merchandise with our friends from Gaia Interactive. That's a German-based merchandise company, which is doing merchandise for Overwatch and I don't know, quite a lot of big brands, Borderlands, etc., etc. All our own brands, of course, but that is also possible for any partner that reaches out and wants to do merchandise with us. With this quick rundown, just a quick look at our global setup. So the red bubbles or boxes are our internal studios. As you can see, just like our offices, they are very focused on Europe, of course, because we are German-based or German-originated company. But we also have studios and offices in the US, in Asia, in Australia. So we can run every game's release on a global scale, of course. Also the physical distribution we can run on a global scale, always depending on what the partner needs. But now let's get to the topic itself, how to get your game published. This is, of course, a bit of a case-by-case scenario. So those tips that I will present to you now are very general, let's say. That doesn't have to be true for every project. For some projects, it might be a bit more deeper than I presented to you here, because of, like, you know, if the budget is about 50 million US dollars, then of course the whole process is a bit longer, let's say, or more in detail than if it's a smaller project. But I guess some of those tips are very general, so you can probably stick to them. So the first part is, of course, how to reach out and how to get in touch with a publisher like us. There are various things you can do, either reach out via email or reach out on LinkedIn, or of course set up a meeting at any event that is happening, like Gamescom, GDC, whatever, or on those online events that are happening at the moment. And the first thing, why does it not work? The first thing when getting in touch is, of course, to be precise about what you are looking for and what you are working on. So that is something that happens quite often, that we just get an email with, hey, I'm working on an RPG, are you interested? And that's it. And that is, of course, not very helpful for us. So if you reach out on whatever occasion it is, even if it's for like a meet to match kind of thing where you send out an invitation for a meeting, please be precise and tell us what you are doing, what you're looking for. Is it full funding and publishing deal? Is it just a distribution deal? Whatever it is, just tell us. Also be precise in terms of what kind of platforms do you plan to release on? Can you port the game to all those platforms, or would you need support in, you know, doing the console port because you only are experienced in PC development? How much money do you need, etc., etc. So all those basic information are very helpful for us in the very first step, because when we get an invitation with all those basic information, we can at least have a very first impression whether or not the meeting makes sense at all. Because sometimes we can just tell you, we certainly will not be interested in a game like this out of various reasons. Also be prepared. That includes, of course, the stuff that we would need from you once we want to start into to look into the project. So a pitch deck is like the given must, let's say. We need to have it to get a first impression of the game. Also, the more unique the game is or is meant to be, the more important it is to get a prototype, a demo, a gameplay video, whatever, GDD if possible, because we need to understand how does the game play, what is the game about, what is the unique factor of the game. But also to be prepared means, before you reach out to somebody, check who you want to talk to, because we oftentimes get invitations from companies who are working on mobile games, for example, while we are not doing mobile games. So it doesn't make any sense to send us an invitation, of course. So be prepared in terms of, like, look at the company you are reaching out. Is the company a fit for you at all? And if it's a fit, then of course reach out, be precise, and have everything at hand that might be helpful for the partner to understand what the game is about and what you want. Be realistic. That is also something that we oftentimes see. So this is true for quite a lot of factors, of course. So be realistic when you send in the budget needs that you have, because usually we will ask you for a budget plan, a staffing plan. We will look into all that and try to see whether or not the budget makes sense at all. Also, you know, if you would be based, I don't know, in South America, and you would say you have a burn rate of 25,000 per month per man, then this certainly is not realistic. So, you know, think about what you ask for, what you present. Also be realistic in terms of when you have a pitch deck and you list certain key members. Oftentimes we see that, of course, people also list the experience they have. And if we talk about Poland, for example, then people would probably list, okay, I worked on Witcher 3, which sounds great. But if we look people up on LinkedIn, for example, and we see the guy was just a QA intern for 3 months, then this is not a relevant experience for us, of course. So be realistic in everything that you share in terms of information, because of course we will dig very deeply into those things. And if we find a lot of like, strange information, then this would certainly not be helpful to strike a deal with us. And also, that is also very important, be nice. We always say, striking a deal with a publisher is more or less like a marriage. And you would probably not marry anybody who you don't like. So always try to be nice. Of course, you don't have to respond to an email within 2 minutes, but just be a friendly person, and that helps a lot to have a good conversation about the project. So once this first step is done and you manage to deliver everything that we need, and we start to look into the project and start the evaluation, we usually, as said already, we have a very thorough look into everything. So we look at the pitch deck, we read through GDDs if we get them, even if they are 100 pages long or stuff like that. We really dig deep into the game to get a good understanding of what the game is about. We also do, of course, a lot of like competitor analysis. We look up reference games and sales numbers for them, because we have all the relevant sales charts at hand, just to get a good impression. What is the project, and is it something that we want to step in? Usually, if this first step is over, either we have a lot of additional questions, which we send you via email, or we send you the feedback why we are not interested in stepping in. Because we don't just say no, we usually also provide the feedback, what led to the decision. Oftentimes people are really happy about that, because they can sometimes, improve on some things, or they get feedback that they didn't think about, etc., etc. Also, what can happen is, of course, various follow-up calls that can be with our brand and marketing teams, that can be with our live operations teams who want to look into, like, if it's a service game, of course, or a free-to-play game. They usually discuss stuff like monetization strategies, server structure, etc., etc. Everything that is needed to run a live operations game. Also, for example, follow-up calls with our production teams. They usually try to, find out risks and how to mitigate them, or discuss any kind of in-house software that you might be using, just to see how you set up the whole production, and if it's on the one hand realistic again, that you can deliver the game in budget and on time as you said, or if we need to adapt things already in the milestone plan before we even sign the deal. So especially this point is a bit depending on the scale of the project. The bigger the project, the more follow-up calls will happen, of course, because we then need to really nail down on the risks that might be coming up, because if the more money we spend, the riskier it is for us. Yeah, and then once everything, all that happened and everything went good, we usually start the offer and terms or contract negotiations, and that is also again very case-by-case scenario. So in terms of like royalty shares, IP discussions, and stuff like that, which is usually very important for developers, I cannot give you a rule of thumb kind of thing that is always like this, because that is very much depending on the amount of money that we have to spend, etc., etc. So yeah, but as I said, it's just a very quick rundown. And then one final point here is just from our perspective why we are anyway interested in the Polish games industry, because of course we could also talk to people from the UK, the US, Germany, whatever. But on the one hand, the Polish games industry, at least from our experience, shows great talent and competitive budgets. That is probably mainly true because, you have big companies like Flying Wild Hog, you have CD Projekt, you have Techland, and they are very good in training people. And we see a lot of people dropping out of those bigger studios and then founding their own studios. We also work with some of those, let's say, newly found studios at the moment. And that's, of course, great because you have great talent, you have very creative people over there. and also, as said, the budgets is they are very competitive, especially if you compare them to the UK or to the US, for example. So it's a very interesting market for us to step in. Then, of course, we have a strong network. On the one hand, we have a territorial office in Poland ourselves. So those guys, they know like everybody more or less in the Polish games industry. So whenever we get a pitch out of Poland, we of course usually ask them if they know the guys, what they think about them, what they think about the studio, what they think about the game, etc. But we also, in our headquarters here in Munich, we also have some people from Poland internally. They also know a lot of people. So that is, of course, very helpful for us because for example, in Canada, it's a bit trickier for us to really get this first-hand feedback on people. And another very important thing for us is, of course, issues with like time zones and stuff like that. That is always helpful if there is not a big time difference. So, of course, from Munich to Warsaw or whatever, it's more or less like nothing. So if you have a studio in the US, of course, or in Australia or wherever, then the collaboration is just a bit trickier because you always need to find the perfect times for a call and stuff like that, or you have, if you send something, some request in the evening, then it takes at least more or less a day to get the answer, which is not true for the Polish games industry. And also, what is of course much easier is to, on the one hand, just go there to do due diligence instead of just calls. Do it in the studio, sit down with the people, out of Corona times, of course. But it's much easier for us, and also because of the like strong network kind of thing, and our local office in Warsaw, we also can, for example, much easier place a producer out of Poland in the studio, which might be a bit trickier if it's in Canada, just to name this example again. So that makes the collaboration for us much easier, and also for the partner, of course, because usually they get feedback from our side also quicker than if there is a big time difference, etc. Yeah, and that's more or less it. As I said, I wanted to rush through that a bit. I just want to hint you on one great video from GDC 2017 by Brian Upton that is called 30 Things I Hate About Your Game Pitch. You can discuss about the title, of course, but it's a good summary of like stuff you can do wrong if you reach out to a publisher, if you pitch a game. Feel free to watch it. It's about 30 minutes long or so. It's really good. And also my contact details, if you saw them. If you want to get in touch, of course, reach out via LinkedIn or via email. We are always happy to have a look at any pitch. And the worst case is that we say no to your game. So. But besides that, feel free to shoot with your questions now.
Great, thank you very much, Sebastian. Let's jump directly into the questions. So again, just use the live questions tab in Eventory. So you can just type in your questions, and we will put it here on stage. So one thing that came in mind is how many people are normally involved in such a pitch project at Koch Media? Is it just you and a finance guy, or more?
It's much more, but it depends on the size of the project. So our department, so like the business development department, we are 6 or 7. I would have to count now because we just got a new colleague. I'm not 100% sure if it's 6 or 7, but anyway. So we always discuss projects within our department first, of course. So usually if you would reach out and send a pitch to me, I would have a look first and do the predetermination whether or not the game is anyway suitable for us. Because I said, if it's a mobile game or so, then I can just quickly send you an email. Nope. But if it might be an interesting game, then I start the in-depth evaluation. Then usually we have a meeting every 2 weeks, roughly, where we discuss projects in our department. And once the feedback in this meeting is good, or sometimes also the feedback is, okay, we have to look into that, people have to play the build and whatever. But once the feedback there is good, then of course we start to involve all the other departments, like marketing, for example, if it's necessary, or live ops, if it's necessary. Our digital sales guys, our sales planning in general, so those guys do the forecasts for digital and physical sales. So usually the whole process certainly is like 15 to 20 people overall.
Oh.
But of course, 6 to 7 is just the business development department. So in additional people, usually you have so like 5 to 7 probably, depending on the size of the project. So the bigger the size, the more people are involved, of course. If it's just a small project with like, I don't know, 500,000 investment or so, then we do that a bit quicker, of course, because then the risk is not too high for us.
Mm-hmm. So we've got the first question from the audience. It's called, do you generally have the feeling that the funding requests from indies are too low or too high from what you have seen?
That's a bit tricky to answer, actually, because the funding request is, of course, very depending on where the people are located. So in the US, of course, the funding needs to be much higher than in, I don't know, Brazil, for example. But on the other hand, to be honest, we usually, as I said, we look into the numbers that we are getting presented. And of course, if we think, okay, this doesn't make sense, be it it's too high or too low, then we would discuss that with the studio anyway and ask them if they are really sure that this will work out. So just to give you an example, we are currently talking to a Spanish studio and they are asking for something like 30 to 50,000 euros, which is really not much, of course. But they could clearly explain how this number is, coming together and that it's working for them. So then it's totally fine. But we sometimes have the case, of course, that people either went too high or too low. And then we can, of course, together find the right amount or to discuss that, because it doesn't make sense for us to sign the project and then afterwards, like 6 to 12 months later, the guys come up and say, okay, we need 500,000 more, because that means to negotiate again, etc., etc., etc. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Is there a typical and avoidable mistake or wrong expectation you see in the pitches over and over again each day and you think, not again, please?
Yeah, I guess a typical problem is that people, of course, want to do all platforms that are available, like PC, PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, but they cannot do it actually. So that is something that oftentimes happens. And at least from our perspective, it's better to be honest right from the beginning and tell us, okay, we can only do PC. And we would like to see the game on console, but we cannot do it. We need help with that. Of course, it can be that you just need the development kits, for example. That is easy for us. We can help with that. But if it's, if you are lacking the expertise in developing the ports for any console or so, then it's good to know from the beginning, and also good to know, that we can start looking into that matter, whether or not we want to do a console port, and if we want to do it, who we could reach out to. Of course, thanks to being a part of the Embracer Group, we always can reach out to Saber Interactive, for example. The guys did Witcher and Crysis for Switch, so they know how to do a console port. But of course, we need to check whether or not they have the capacity to do it on in the long run. So that is a mistake that oftentimes happens, at least from the pitches that we get, that people just name everything and hope to strike the deal with that without, or sometimes even with knowing that they will not be able to do it themselves.
Okay. Have the lockdowns and COVID in general accelerated the process of finding new games because you don't have to travel around the world visiting conferences and studios and trade fairs, or has it slowed down the process for some reasons?
So the process itself, I guess, is more or less the same as before. Of course, the whole situation made meeting a lot of people and studios easier because we attended much more events last year than we would usually do. We also, we said, okay, we never attended this event, or it seems very small, but let's do it anyway because it's online. We probably wouldn't have traveled there, but online it's easier. The process itself from first contact to signing the contract, that has not changed much because it's still the same process on our side with all the evaluations and feedback rounds and stuff like that. The only thing that has changed is that, for example, due diligence now happens in a call instead of like on site because you cannot travel. But yeah, it's more or less the same, let's say.
Okay. Another question here from the audience. Do you prefer that developers already build up their own community and communication about the game during the development, or do you prefer that the publisher sets the tone for communication and community without the developer interfering?
That is actually both okay for us. So we have projects where we start from the ground up, let's say, with the communication and marketing, but we also have projects where the game is already out in the wild, let's say, and there is a community and a Discord and whatever. That is totally fine. But of course, once we step in as the publisher, we usually ask for a certain communication between the partner and us before doing any kind of announcements or stuff like that, because from that moment on, our marketing department wants to, let's say, steer the communication a bit, because they set certain beats when to announce the game, when do whatever they usually do, of course, like gameplay stuff and I don't know what they release, and they would not like to see the partner, spoiling that stuff before they planned it. So once we step in, we usually say, okay, it's totally fine that you keep going with your community management, let's say, or community engagement, but please, talk to our marketing guys and find a mutual agreement on when and how to communicate certain things. But of course, it also takes away a bit of pressure from our internal teams if they don't have to do that themselves, because if the developer already is engaging with the community, then of course our community people don't have to do it too much anymore. And oftentimes it depends a bit on the game, of course, but oftentimes it's also very helpful because the players feel much much nearer to the developer than to the big evil publisher. So it's oftentimes even beneficial if there is already a working or a living community around the game. So.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 questions. Another one from the audience. Does the presentation of the team members play a role for your decision to publish or not to publish a game? Like if the pitch is not good, can a solid team save the game? Or if the pitch is really good, can a bad team presentation decrease the chances for working together?
So if the game is not good, but the team is great, we probably would still reject the game, because in the end we sell the game and not the team, of course. So the game has to be good and has to be marketable in the end. It doesn't help if you have if you had CD Projekt but they do a really, really shitty game, let's say. Of course, in their case, a bit of hype would probably help to sell the game. But anyway, a good team doesn't, mitigate a bad game design, a bad game. On the other hand, having a great game but a bad team presentation, that would not be a big problem, let's say, because if we think the game is interesting for us or is good, then we would anyway, for example, set up follow-up calls and talk to the team, and then we would probably quickly realize how good is the team or how bad is the team or can they do it, etc., etc. Because also we know that especially if it's a younger team, for example, they don't have the experience on how to present themselves and how to present a game. So there you usually anyway have to talk much more to them and get a good feeling of the team chemistry and stuff like that. But yeah, as I said, a good team cannot mitigate a bad game, while a good game can mitigate perhaps a bad team, as long as they can deliver on what they promise.
So we have tons of another questions here from the audience, but I suppose we will run out of time. Just one question from Koch Media is part of Embracer Group, which is famous for buying studios. So when I apply and pitch a game, is there any risk that I have to become a colleague of you because you buy the brands and the studios, or is this part of the strategy to get all the?
Not necessarily, actually. So of course it could happen that somebody pitches a game, we work together with the game on the game, we release the game, and if the collaboration was good and the game was good, etc., then of course it can happen that acquisition talks might start. Whether or not they come to a let's say, good end. For example, the Kingdom Come Warhorse Studios, they also just worked as a third-party developer with us on Kingdom Come, and once the game was out and the collaboration was great, then those talks started, and it ended up in we acquiring Warhorse Studios. But it's not a must, of course. So that's the same as before. It's a bit like a marriage, and you would not buy anybody, of course, if the collaboration didn't work out, because if you would buy up the studio and the brand, then of course you would need to replace too many people to make a good collaboration out of it. On the other hand, what could of course happen that we start negotiations about just acquiring the IP or the brand without the studio. That sometimes also happens, but yeah, it depends on various factors in the end, but it's not a must.
Okay, I was asked to put another question, so we have to find. What would you say are important qualifications if someone wants to get into publishing? Can you give them one or two qualifications that are important?
Well, if you want to join the business development department, for example, because that's the department I can talk about mainly, then it's of course helpful to have a good understanding of games in general. So I, for example, as you said in the introduction, we worked at PC Games, like in games journalism. So I saw a lot of games. I did a lot of reviews for games and stuff like that. Also, I run the development magazine, Making Games, for like 2 or 3 years. So I already had quite a good network in the German games industry, for example. And that all is, of course, very helpful, because you need to be able to, on the one hand, judge a game on just seeing a prototype, which oftentimes is quite ugly and, just showing very basic gameplay mechanics. So you need to have this understanding what a developer might be able to pull off during like a 2 years development phase. And beside of that, of course, you probably just need to be a nice guy and be able to talk to people and discuss with them their projects and stuff like that. But it really helps to have a good understanding of games, and to be able also, even if you cannot do it in the beginning, but you need to be able to get into like looking into business cases and stuff like that. So to come up with like how many copies of a game could we probably sell just by looking at similar games, and just to see how did the games differ from each other? Why did they sell different numbers? And what does that mean for a project you are looking into? Because in the end, it's a business. So you need to have a solid business case before any board member from our company will anyway give a green light for the project. So that would be the first or the most important thing. For all the other departments, I guess it heavily depends. But in the end, I guess it's always very important to be, very much into gaming. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to start in game publishing.
Thank you, Sebastian. As I said, there are lots of questions left, but I encourage you to use the networking feature eventually, or just drop a mail to Sebastian, so he will answer all the questions that are left. Gamers investing back in the industry. This is the idea of Game Seer Venture Partners. It's a fully privately owned venture fund investing in core and indie multi-platform licenses on PC and console. It's not a bank, it's not a family office, it's not an institution. They claim that every penny invested comes from their own pockets. Sounds good. Well, we're glad that Bertrand Vernizeau is with us today. He is CEO and investment partner at Game Seer Venture Partners, and he talks about when and how to attract an investor for your game. Welcome.
Hello, Petra. Thank you for having me. That's absolutely it. Hello, guys. To you in the audience. I have 10 minutes to do that, so I'll try to be on schedule and respect this. So today we're going to talk about the money and actually how to get it. Everybody wants to know that, I guess, if you're actively raising funds. So I'm going to tell you about what I see from other investors that I talk to, other investors that I invest with, since we recently signed a game with a Polish publisher called All-In Games. You maybe know them. They recently made a game called Ghost Runner, which was fairly successful, if not to say very much so successful. So I'm going to give you tips and tricks on how to attract us, or how to actually appeal to us, and actually when to talk to us. So before I do so, it's really important to understand that there is basically 4 main entities that you guys can raise funds from. So the first one is equity investors. Those guys will basically give you cash in exchange of a chunk of your company, and in exchange of a chunk of your shares. They tend to be quite early stage, because obviously equity investors want to put a certain amount of cash in your company for the highest share possible. Meaning, if I'm very early stage, if I invested $100,000 in Google before it was created, I probably would have had 10 to 20%. Whereas right now, today, obviously, $100,000 in Google is not going to get me much. So those guys were really rely more on a team's abilities, potentially transposable experience. They're basically going to assess very much the team, its past track record, because since they're investing quite early on, that's basically the only available information that they have. How can you attract them? It's not necessarily as a prototype, as I just mentioned, because it's a very early stage, but it's more on the credentials that you're going to give them. So that means you have to come to an equity investor with a very comprehensive elevator pitch, detailed budget breakdown on your project. You have to put an emphasis on strategic vision, and you must be very market and problem solving oriented. They basically look into the team, dive into your capacities to provide those 4 elements. And if you actually do appear, that's when they get into more serious discussions with you. The second one is governmental entities. So for instance, in Canada, there is the CMFFMC. We invested jointly with them in a production in Montreal. In Germany, you have the Förderprogramme. In Denmark, you have Nordisk Film. So those state entities can invest a very early stage. They can invest also mid-stage, and they can also invest at latter stages, later in the life cycle of a studio. What do they look at when you go and talk with them? They really rely more on a very solid business plan for one specific reason. Governmental entities will make you go through different stages when you apply for governmental funding. Usually it can be 1 or 2 stages, but for instance, with the CMFFMC, it can be 4 or 5 stages. So they will really assess in depth your business plan. They will ask you questions. They will make follow-up calls with you. They will give you a grade. The CMF, for instance, does that. I'm not too sure about the ones in Germany, but the CMF will basically give you a grade. And throughout the process, in the application process, they're going to give you a chance to increase this grade as you provide them with more information, again, based on the business plan. Those entities usually also have fixed dates throughout the year to apply. So pay attention if you do want governmental funding for your game. You will have to respect certain deadlines to apply. The third, and obviously mostly known entity to actually get funding is publishers. I think a publisher was here before today at the conference, so you guys have been getting a lot of information about that already. But publishers, you need to go and talk with them when you usually have a demo, when you have a build, any kind of prototype or playable. Art mockups are also very important. They very, very, very rarely invest in equity, and the business model is mainly project financing for recoup via royalties. If you're unlucky, you will have to give them your IP with the deal. Unless you can manage very well. Some don't take IP, some take part of the IP, but usually the terms vary from very good to predatory. So choose very wisely when you talk with a publisher. You have to be a good match. They rely usually heavily on their existing network. So if you're an unknown guy, if you've never met a game before, you will be on an uphill battle, obviously, unless your playable is really mind-blowing. Which is really what matters in the end. The quality of the materials you send to a publisher is what really is going to define their interest in you. I have seen some teams out of nowhere, for instance, this month, put up a prototype online. It's had more than 5 million views on YouTube just for 10 or 15 or 30 second sequences. They're going to put up a wish list. A Steam page is going to get 100,000 wish lists within 30 days. So it doesn't matter if you're not known. If you have those KPIs, you will be attractive for a publisher, that's for sure. Then the last entity is actually people like us, so private investors. You do have more and more private cash coming in the market, and when I say private cash, in our case, it is private. You have also other funds which are raising actively money to not to invest in equity, but to invest also in project financing. So obviously gaming is a very, very hot commodity as of late. There's a lot of cash available on the market. What's really different from a publisher is, while it's also project financing, private investors usually don't care about their brand. I think all the gamers in the audience will agree with me when you've probably played a couple games that were financed by private investors, but you never heard about them. Private investors usually remain in the background. They don't need to build a brand. So that means also that when you negotiate with them, they're not necessarily going to ask you for any IP with the investment. It's very, very rare that a private investor actually asks you for IP or derivatives on your creation. Another incentive is also that private investors are very much hands off the production. So that means that if you talk with a private investor, you will be getting a lot of creative freedom. But it also means that you have to have strong enough shoulder to carry the whole weight of a project on them. Because basically the major difference between a publisher and a private investor is you will be really doing everything. And I'm pretty sure that if you've been involved already with an indie game development, you know that you will have a lot to do. You'll have a lot of tasks daily, and sometimes it's not easy to be running a sprint on your current build, and also talking with the first parties, and talking with the platforms, and talking with your PR agency, and also then selecting an influencers panel for whatever PR beat you're going through. So you really need to have already either a very strong team or a lot of courage. But if you're up to it, we can propose something which is a serious alternative to publishing. We, as I mentioned also earlier in the call, we also sign certain games with publishers directly, because basically when we assess a team, sometimes we feel and we understand and we see that some teams are not ready for self-publishing. So that's when having an executive producer, usually which comes from the publisher, makes sense. Publishers will put money, they will put manpower in the production, will put cash, will put connections with first parties, platforms, and also know-how on how to make money with games distribution and creating traction online. But those are very much complementary. It really depends in the end on the team and what they're ready to do or not ready. So how to attract us really? We really focus on finding in you an ability to deliver on time with the planned budget, an ability to maintain or create a team that has both the technical ability to deliver and the execution capacities to steer the project towards its initial vision. So it's not only necessary to have a good idea at the beginning, you need to be able to execute over time with it. I'm going to give you 500,000 euro, €1 million, maybe 2 million euro. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do over time? Game takes time to do. So it's very important that you use that money well with the right people to deliver on time. So if you display those in hint that you have those elements, then we will consider you very, very seriously. The second part, which is assessing your idea, assessing your game, checking that it is on a segment that people want, that there's obviously certain KPIs that are in the green and not in the red. That's more internal, and that's not something that usually you're involved with. It's more something where we have a reflection on, and we get in touch with you when we are ready to move on. So I have 20 seconds to summarize. Each type of investor has its specific requirement, whether it's equity, whether it's governmental entities, whether it's publishers or private investors. If you need to target an investor which you know you can provide what they actually require during the analysis process. So you need to adapt the materials you sent. This will definitely increase your chances. So half of the job for you to get money is know who you're talking to, what to give to those people, what they need to properly assess you, and that's already half the job. The rest, the 25% that remain, is to display when you're speaking with us, regardless of what investment you're looking for, you need to convince us that you have the ability to deliver on time within a reasonable time frame, which will be one that is planned in advance. And if you can show that you can do this while we validate the fact that the project that you want to bring to the market is something gamers want, then the stars align, and that's actually the remaining part, and then you get to 100% and you get your money. That was 10 minutes. I think I got it right on time. So if anybody got questions, I'm just going to leave my mail in the chat. I'm sorry, 10 minutes is extremely long for such a very complex topic. There is a lot more to say. But
yes, I think a lot of people in the audience want to talk to you, so they can do that via email, or they can use the networking feature here in Eventually. Both will work. Thanks very much for all the insights and the tips. Thank you.